we wish to welcome you to the third presentation of the virtual LRCCS Noon Lecture Series Winter Term 2021. My name is Per Kassel. I'm the Director of Graduate Studies at the International Institute. I'm also an Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History at the University of Michigan. And I'm delighted to introduce you to our speaker for today's talk. The complete series schedule is available on the China Center's website, and email reminders go out weekly. At the end of the presentation, we invite you to submit any questions you may have for our speaker by typing your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We begin with a few announcements. The next presentation in the LRCCS Noon Lecture Series will be held on February 9th and will be given by Xiufei Ren, Associate Professor of Sociology at Michigan State University, who will be speaking on governing the urban in China and in India. To help bring the new Lunar New Year, the CHOP film series will be showing the film Last Train Home, directed by Li Xin-fan on Wednesday, February 10th at 7 p.m. The film puts a human face on travel during Chinese New Year by focusing on one family of migrant workers as they journey back to their home. Professor Mary Gallagher, Director of the International Institute, will be the discussant. Today's presentation will be given by Jaymin Kim, Assistant Professor of History at St. Thomas University in Minnesota. He received his PhD in History from the University of Michigan in 2018 and has been an LRCCS Center Associate since then. I also want to add that Jaymin was my student back when, so I'm very proud and happy to see him return to Michigan, albeit in remote, to deliver his recent advances in his research. Today, Jaymin will be speaking on becoming the inner Kirghiz, Qianlong Emperor's policy towards 5 tribes in Qing Xinjiang. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. As Per said, it's great to be back, although it's virtual. I remember when I started my PhD education at Michigan in 2008, I came to probably every Tuesday noon lecture. Back then, we also had sandwiches, so really helped me, live on my grad student budget with the stipend and all. So it's really nice to be back, even though we no longer have sandwiches and so on. So today I'm going to be, oh yeah, I guess I should start sharing my screen. Yeah, today I'm going to be speaking on the inner Kirghiz. This is a term that I coined. The sources themselves don't show this term, but I'm going to be explaining why I chose this term and what the term, how I define my term and so on. So I'm going to start by introducing my larger talk, my larger research project, which is a book manuscript on Qing relations with 3 of its tributary neighbors. And then we're going to go on to inner Kirghiz society, what it means, how I define it, some key characteristics. And then we're going to be looking at 3 case studies focusing on 3 inner Kirghiz chieftains who had various degrees of relationship with the Qing officials in Xinjiang as well as the Qianlong emperor. So let's start by, putting my larger project in historiographical context. So my larger work, is in conversation with 2 main bodies of scholarship. First is the scholarship on the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty in imperial China. So when we speak of Qing history today, it is inevitable that we, look to the new Qing history, which, since it started in the 90s, is maybe not so new anymore, but, still it had some fundamental differences from the way it looked at the Qing dynasty versus what we used to think. So before new Qing history, the consensus was that Qing was the last pre-modern Chinese dynasty. Even though it was founded by the Manchus, they became Sinicized. They became Chinese, culturally speaking and politically speaking, so that it was no different from its predecessors such as Ming. Now with new Qing history scholars like Mark Elliott here with his The Manchu Way, Peter Perdue with his work on China marches west, now we focus on Qing Inner Asian frontiers. And we also have seen how Qing was different from, say, Ming. And these scholars overall have highlighted the indirect rule of Inner Asian frontiers through flexible patron-client relationships, as well as the Manchu ethnic sovereignty that distinguished Qing as an early modern and Inner Asian empire. My project shifts the focus a little bit. Despite all its achievements, New Qing history has this these limited framework that I'm going to explain with a map in a little bit. So here, this is a map of Qing from 1820. Since this is an early modern time, we should not take these borders as a given. They were a lot more flexible and they're more zonal than linear, as we see here. But this, I'm going to explain what the New Qing history has done. So the red line here separates the core zone of China proper from Inner Asian frontiers such as Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. The red line here, on the other hand, marks today's borders of the People's Republic of China. New Qing history has so far limited its spatial and conceptual framework within this red line. So even though these scholars argue that Qing was not China, Qing was an Inner Asian early modern empire, we still are limited by today's, national border, so the PRC. My project looks at the zones outside the PRC borders. So I look at how Qing interacted with its smaller tributary neighbors, such as Korea, Vietnam, and Kokand in today's Uzbekistan, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. So as such, this is also work that builds on the scholarship on tributary system. More than 50 years ago, John Fairbank and Su Tong, they came up with the thesis of Chinese world order. Fairbank and Tong, they emphasize the sinocentric and hierarchical nature of the tributary system, as well as the gap between how the system worked in theory and in practice. According to Fairbank and Tong, Korea, Vietnam, and the Ryukyu Islands were 2-3 model tributaries where there was not much gap between theory and practice. Since this is an old framework, of course, in the past 50 years, many scholars, including John Wills and James Hiviel, among others, have criticized this model from empirical and theoretical perspectives. Meanwhile, when we turn to, Korea and Vietnam, the general historiographical trend until recently has been to write autonomous histories of the nation in reaction against colonial historiographies. So in Korea, for example, the Japanese colonial scholarship had argued that Korea had always been backward and needed external influence from more advanced neighbors such as China and Japan. The French colonial scholarship, on the other hand, similarly, had characterized Vietnam as an inferior imitation of its neighbor China, basically a little China. So the consensus and the main historical trend in these countries has been to write autonomous histories of Korea and Vietnam. Korea is not China, Vietnam is not China, and even though they were engaging in tributary relationships with Qing and Ming, that was a facade, that was an illusion. Nothing serious went on in practice. In short, Korea and Vietnam were autonomous. So in my research, I focus on the praxis of tributary relations. So I want to know what was actually happening between Qing and its tributary neighbors, and especially the model tributaries of Korea and Vietnam, because we're going to see that the model was actually, There were just like too many variants there and so on. And as such, I'm building on some recent, very exciting work by that had come out recently. Yuan Chong Wang has a book on Manchu-Korean relations. Kathleen Baldanza has a work on Ming China and Lei Vietnam. These two works have really shown how these relations work in practice. So now we can go beyond the dichotomy of Chinese superiority versus Korean and Vietnamese and other tributary autonomy and so on. So that is what I do in my project. As I mentioned, I compare the praxis of tributary relationships between Qing and Korea here, Vietnam here, and Kokand in today's Uzbekistan. I especially focus on how these states handled criminals and refugees in their borderlands. So it's a study on jurisdictions, boundaries, and sovereignty ultimately. So I would like to, talk briefly about the larger project, but also for today's talk. For this larger project, I use three main bodies of sources. First, of course, I use Qing archival sources from Beijing and Taipei in classical Chinese and in Manchu. Here you see a picture of me standing next to the 283 volume collection of the Manchu-language palace Manchu-language archival materials from Qing Xinjiang. The Asia Library has the whole collection, and I really want to give them a shout out for scanning so many portions of the collection for me. So I was supposed to be in Vietnam last summer doing research, and then, of course, the pandemic happened, and this really helped me and allowed me to get research done at home in Minnesota. The talk today literally would not have been possible without help from the Asia Library and without my Center Associate status through the LRCCS. So thank you. In any case, Qing archival sources are at the center of my larger project and this talk, especially Manchu language sources. They are the raw texts that were later sanitized into diplomatic documents as well as some other official documents. They've been at the center of my attempt to write a comparative history of Asian borderlands. I also use diplomatic documents such as the one you see here, Dongmunhuigo, which is a Korean collection of diplomatic documents, exchanged between Korea and China, but also Korea and Japan. On the right, we also see other published sources such as Quang Mok, which is a Vietnamese chronicle that is very useful in showing discussions internal to these courts and so on. So using these groups of sources, I argue that interstate jurisdiction and boundaries in these borderlands were flexible and shifting. And I also argue that these conceptions show interstate jurisdiction to be asymmetric. So these are not done on the basis of interstate equality as we're used to in our post-Westphalian norm. That was not the case when we look at the praxis of Qing tributary relations. And moreover, this jurisdiction, along with flexible boundaries, show Qing imperial sovereignty and tributary sovereignties to have an elastic. By elastic, I mean sovereignty that encompassed degrees of sovereignty ranging from partial to full and beyond full from our modern perspective, which posits the principles of interstate equality and non-interference as the norms of international relations in the world. Now, let's focus on today's talk. Today, I'm going to present the Inner Kirghiz as a case study and an introduction to my larger project. The Kirghiz occupy this awkward position on scholarship, in scholarship on Qing Xinjiang. So, the Kirghiz were The Kirghiz were decentralized and fragmented, so they escaped the attention of scholars interested in Qing relations with Central Asian quote-unquote states. They are tribes, so they don't fall under this category. On the other hand, historians of Qing Xinjiang consider the Kirghiz as nomadic outsiders, so they only mention them in passing when their path crossed those of the native Altishaari, today's Uyghurs. So in this talk, I'm going to define the Inner Kirghiz in the next section. And in section 3, I'm going to show how these relationships patron-client relationships between the Qianlong Emperor and the Inner Kyrgyz chieftains worked in practice by looking at the careers of three Inner Kyrgyz clients in more detail. So let's move on to the next section. Before we do that, a few maps that can help us orient ourselves in, I'm sure foreign geography to some of you. So this is a Qing map of Xinjiang from 1759, held by the Library of Congress. So here you see the Jiayuguan, the symbolic and administrative boundary between China proper and what lay beyond. And here we see the northern Xinjiang, also known as Zungaria, that is separated between north and south through the Tian Shan Mountains. And our talk is going to focus on the southern half of Xinjiang, Altishar. And we are going to, to be more specific, be focusing on the regions of Kashgar, Turpan, and Aksu that we see here. Zooming in, this is a map of Kashgar region from the same set of maps. And here too, I just want you to note the Tian Shan on the north and the Pamirs separating Qing Altishar from Zungaria, Andijan, which is today's Uzbekistan, the Kirghiz, and Badakhshan. So here I just want to point out that this map makes us think that the Kyrgyz were all living outside Altishar, as we're going to see today. Not the case. There were the Inner Kyrgyz living within Qing Altishar in many different regions. This is the map that shows the Kyrgyz transhumance in the 20th century. As such, it gets rid of the national borders that we see today between China and its neighbors. So here we see Kashgar, Yarkand, and Aksu, three key cities of Altishar. And I just want to point out that I'm going to be focusing on 5 Inner Kyrgyz tribes that lived in Qing Altishar, for which you can identify on this map. There is the Cherik, there is the Kipchak here, there is the sorry about the Chongbagishi here, and there is the Qushchu somewhere here, but that's not the important point. So I'll just skip on to the next slide. So who are the Inner Kyrgyz and how do I define the Inner Kyrgyz? Before we get to that point, we first have to look at the Altishari back clients of the Qianlong Emperor, which were at the center of Qing rule over Xinjiang and even more so Qing rule over Altishar. So the Baks of Xinjiang, they were secular elites that had their power, share their power with the religious authorities of Xinjiang before the Qing conquest. When Qing conquered the region, the Qing state incorporated the Bak elites as its ranked local officials. So there were ranked 3 Hakim Baks, governors of the largest cities such as Kashgar, down to rank 7 Baks of various functions. So the Qing state, the Qianlong Emperor, wanted to cultivate Bak loyalty. So they granted them additional rewards and privileges. They gave them land and bondsmen, essentially slaves or serfs. They also gave them stipends annually paid out of the Qing coffers, and rank insignia such as rank buttons and feathers, and the privilege of participating in imperial audience in Beijing on a set schedule. I mentioned this because when we look at the Inner Kyrgyz situation, we see that many of the Inner Kyrgyz chieftains maintain very similar patron-client relationships with the Qianlong Emperor that just had not been acknowledged too much in this scholarship. Most importantly, they received fixed pastures in Altishar at the approval of the emperor. This pasture assignment made them Inner Kyrgyz under the jurisdiction of the Qing officials known as Amban, stationed in main cities such as Kashgar, Uch-Turpan, and Aksu. The Kyrgyz who lived in their own pastures beyond Qing Altisher, on the other hand, were the outer Kyrgyz. So here I want to mention the inner-outer distinction is something that I came up with mostly. Sometimes the sources do talk about outer Kyrgyz, but mostly for the inner Kyrgyz, they use the terms such as, the Kyrgyz under jurisdiction of the Amban, or the Kyrgyz who live close to the Karungar post line. But, the inner outer distinction is something that we do see throughout these sources, not explicitly, but implicitly. So there were three categories of Kyrgyz chieftains who were granted pastures in the initial years of Qing rule over Altisher. First of all, there were those who were already pasturing in Altisher. The Noygut Kyrgyz, led by Gaday Mirza, is a great example. So when the Qing forces entered the region of Aksu in pursuit of the Koja brothers who had, quote unquote, rebelled against Qing, they found these 69 households and 240 people of the Noygut Kyrgyz in Aksu. They submitted to the Qing generals, and in return, they received 4 villages northeast of city of Aksu as their pasture, including Kizilbulak, which you see on this map. Sorry, it's just very small on my screen. So, but yeah. These 4 villages the Noygut received, and along with that fixed pasture assignment put them under the jurisdiction of the Aksu Amban officials in Qing Qing officials in Aksu. And then they got this document with the official seal that put that also spelled out that they were going to pay taxes the same as the Muslims of Aksu. Next, and second and most commonly, Kyrgyz chieftains, they received pastures from the Qing state after claiming their ancestral pastures were in areas now under Qing control. In making these requests, they were claiming to be coming home. But this homecoming, I have to emphasize, was dependent on pasture assignment from the Qing state, which ultimately required the imperial approval. That was not rubber stamp. So we see that the Kipchak under Akim, the Cherik under Essen, the Chongbagishi under Awal, these 3 chieftains, they did receive pastures in their former homelands, such as the Chongbagish pasture in Kashgar in the region surrounding Toyun. But at the same time, in 1760, we see another Kyrgyz chieftain, the Qushchu Beg Narabatu, making the same request, but being denied pasture assignment. So here, Narabatu was coming from today's Uzbekistan. He was claiming that he had pastured, his tribe had pastured in the region of Kashgar in the past. So the Qing Amban went to the Kashgar Begs to ask about the situation, and they said, no, that's not the case. These Kyrgyz are transient vultures. They come here when we are weak. They leave when we're strong. So they used to pasture here, but only for like a couple of years at a time. Their real home is in Uzbekistan. So in this moment, in this instance, their request for pasture assignment was denied. But 2 years later, they were allowed to pasture in a land assigned by the Qing state in a different context. That's the third category of the Kyrgyz receiving fixed pastures. Basically, refugees seeking refuge in Qing Altisher. So in 1762, Narabatu sent another request for pasture, but this time both the officials and the Qianlong emperor were much more receptive because of 2 factors. First, Narabatu's situation had become much more dire. He was in real conflict with Kokhan ruler Iridana B, who was pursuing this centralizing goal. So he and his Kyrgyz had been driven out of their pasture. In the process, half of the people had scattered. So these were not, they were not looking good at the time. Second, the Kyrgyz chieftains who had already been incorporated, and the Kashgar Beks were much more receptive to requests this time around. And they used what we see a lot in Qing imperial rhetoric in their reasoning. Basically, they said in the past 2 years, because of imperial grace, the whole region is under peace now. The Kyrgyz had been transformed so much that they're not so different from the Altishari. Basically, the distinction between the settled and the nomadic had disappeared. So it should be no problem accepting this new group of Kyrgyz into Altishar. So in this third context, as refugees, the Qushchu were allowed to live as inner Kyrgyz. So now let's look at what they were supposed to be like, because Qing officials and Altishari Beks, they still did share biases of the settled, of the agricultural societies against the Kyrgyz nomads. So a lot of documents keep talking about this Kyrgyz nature. By nature, they're fond of profit, which make them, rob the caravans. By nature, they're not dependable. They move around. You cannot depend on them for anything. So this is their view on Kyrgyz nature. And Qing launched this civilizing mission to transform these undependable, bad nature of the Kyrgyz into the inner Kyrgyz way. So first of all, the Qing state sought to transform this nature by putting them under the Qing officials' Amban's jurisdiction. So all Kyrgyz who received pastures from Qing, the inner Kyrgyz, they came under the jurisdiction of the Altishar counselor, who would keep a record of their names and personal histories and report to the Qing court in Beijing every season, so 4 times a year. At a more local level, the inner Kyrgyz were under the jurisdiction of the Amban at Kashgar and Ush-Turpan and Aksu, who above all focused on 2 things: Kyrgyz robberies or raids against caravans and unauthorized movement. So first of all, Scott Levy, historian of Central Asia, early modern Central Asia, has shown that the state and the mercantile elite of Central Asia were in this symbiotic relationship. So caravan traffic, more of that, meant personal revenue for the ruler. So the ruler sought to attract merchants by building infrastructure such as roads, hostels, and so on, while ensuring safe travel for caravans. The Qing state did something very similar. They put trusted inner Kyrgyz chieftains as basically specialists in ensuring caravan safety. And when there were raids, robberies against the caravans, they put these inner Kyrgyz chieftains to task to protect the caravans and to recover the stolen goods and to punish the robbers responsible. And it wasn't always the case that the inner Kyrgyz were the good ones and the outer Kyrgyz were the bad ones from the Qing perspective, but the dichotomy was still there. From Qing perspective, outer Kyrgyz outside Qing Altishar, they were the bad ones, still, following their nature and robbing caravans. The inner Kyrgyz were the good guys who were taking care of this mess. Second, there was this restriction of movement. So this was basically the Qing attempt to transform what in the Qing Southwest would have been called raw barbarians into cooked barbarians, as we see in this work by Laura Hostler from Miao album in the Qing Southwest. So the Kyrgyz, since they are nomads, they're pastoralists, they have to move around seasonally. Qing was okay with seasonal movements because they knew that this was within the realm of expected. But for any large-scale, long-distance movement, the Kyrgyz chieftains had to get approval from the Qing officials and ultimately from the Qianlong emperor. And we're going to see how that, came to be issues of concern between Qing and inner Kyrgyz chieftains. So not causing trouble and acting as the inner Kyrgyz, that was the minimum requirements. Some inner Kyrgyz chieftains went beyond that by providing many types of service. Military service was the most useful one. In the Qing conquest of Altishar in 1758 and 9, many Kyrgyz chieftains provided military service, fighting alongside the Qing forces and often guiding the Qing forces into foreign terrains of Altishar, but also into Central Asia, today's Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. As such, these Kyrgyz chieftains are an important and understudied part of Qing conquest of Xinjiang. And they also served during the 1765 rebellion of which Turpan Muslims. This was a contest that divided the new Qing subjects of Altishar into two camps, anti-Qing, pro-Qing, and many inner Kyrgyz chieftains that we are looking at today stood on the side of Qing to fight the quote-unquote rebels. So that was one thing. They also, as I have, hinted at, they resolved some Kyrgyz robbery cases. So let me just give you an overlook. So usually the caravans, which were usually coming from Kokand and Andijan, but also from farther away too, such as Badakhshan and Bukhara and so on. So they usually had to pass through Kyrgyz pastures to get to Altishar. After they got robbed, they would report the robbery to the Qing Amban in Kashgar or Yarkand or Aksu or Uch-Turpan. And the Amban would basically form this task force composed of inner Kyrgyz chieftains and Altishar banks, and together they would track down the outer Kyrgyz culprits, going to the Kyrgyz pastures outside the Qing territorial boundaries in today's Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. And they would go to these pastures, they would try and punish the offenders in accordance with what they called Kyrgyz custom, and they would recover the stolen goods for the owners back in these cities in Altishar. So these services were also essential in the Qing rule over Altishar. Third, some Kyrgyz also helped take care of the government herd in Kashgar. The Qing state needed to keep a large stock of cattle, horses, camels, and so on, sheep, and so on. And in 1763, in Kashgar, the Amban were wondering about a cool place with good pasture. They were concerned that there were too many mosquitoes and gadflies in summer, just not good environment for pasturing. So they summoned two inner Kyrgyz chieftains, Akim and Awa, to ask them about a good place. And these inner Kyrgyz chieftains, they actually volunteered to care for the herd for the summer month. So the pilot program started. They were given about 90 head of cattle each. They went back to their pastures north of Kashgar, much cooler and by the mountains. And when they came back in the full month, the Amban were really pleased by how fat the cattle were, how healthy they were, and so on. So throughout the rest of the Qianlong period, the inner Kyrgyz regularly provided this herding service for the Qing government livestock, Qing government herd. And this is very striking because when we look at imperial relationship with nomads, not just Qing, but the Russians and the Ottomans and so on, the number one concern is that they steal livestock. And here we see the inner Kyrgyz taking care of the livestock for the government. Okay, all of these services were rewarded by material rewards, such as bolts of silk and trade opportunities. But more importantly for us, these services resulted in inner Kyrgyz promotion within the Qing bureaucracy. They were given rank insignia, like the rank buttons and peacock feathers that the Qing bureaucrats and Altishar bags wore. They also were sometimes given official posts and annual stipends, much like the local officials of Xinjiang and the bag clients. All of that basically put the inner Kyrgyz as the local elite dynasties that were created by the Qing. This kind of personal relationship between the emperor and the inner Kyrgyz chieftain could extend beyond the first generation. So for the inner Kyrgyz, the succession of the B or ahalakchi positions, which are titles of their chieftain positions, could be inherited by their sons or younger brothers or cousins, but this succession had to be approved by the Qing Amban and the emperor. And early on in Qing rule over Altisar, the Qing state, linked the succession of chieftaincy to the inheritance of imperial gifts. So rank insignia, for example, could be inherited with imperial approval as a sign of succession. Those who had real estate, such as gardens, alfalfa fields, and so on, and those who received annual stipends could also have these things inherited by their successors as well. Here, I would just like to emphasize that these practices put the inner Kirghiz chieftains on a level with the Altishari beks. So Qing, by cultivating loyalty of these local groups, had created the local dynasties that we're going to be looking at real quick in a little bit. And then I'm also going to be showing later on how some of these local elites, Inner Kirghiz and Altishari, actually maintain their own networks of marriage alliance as well as other interactions. And here I just have this portrait of Qing officer Namjal, just to give you a visual sense of what this rank insignia look like. This is the peacock feather, and this is the rank button for the the red rank button, ruby, which was for rank 2 officials of the Qing bureaucracy. So here, just a quick look on Inner Kirghiz dynasties. Those who were succeeded for more than, like 2 times. So here, for example, we see the Noygutbi Gadai Mirza going through 4 successions, through his son, grandson, and great-grandson, and so on. And we see other 3 dynasties as well. If time allows, we're going to come back to this topic. Sorry about the poor time management. It seems that we're not going to get through the whole thing. So I'll be very brief here with the case studies. So Akim was the Kipchak B, the Kirghiz B of the Kipchak Kirghiz, who was the hegemon of the Pamir Mountains. He was someone who was already influential before Qing came around, but became even more influential through his service, military service with the Qing, as it was conquering Altishar and then chasing after the Khoja brothers in today's Tajikistan. For that service, he received the rank 2B post of Sulamban, or Sanjidachan, which, as the title indicates, was a sinecure post, but still it was a rank 2 post, very important. And here again, we see the same portrait, because this would have been the peacock feather and rank button that Akim would have worn as a sign of his foremost position within the Qing Inner Kirghiz society. In fact, among the Kirghiz, he was often known as the Sulamban, or the chieftain with the red rank button. And that was something that was known throughout Altishar, but also far beyond in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and so on, because his sphere of influence was quite large. Not only that, he was also appointed as the Hakim Bek, the governor of the city of Tashmilik in the region of Kashgar, which meant that he had 3 sources of power. First, as a regular member of the Qing bureaucracy, as the Hakim Bek, which usually were reserved for Bek elites of Altisharis, which are more or less today's Uyghurs. He was also the B of the Kipchak Kirghiz in Yengisar, where his assigned pastures were in the region of Egus and other places near the city of Yengisar. Not only that, his ancestral pasture was in the region of Sarikol, which is in today's Pamirs, near the district of Yarkand, and he still maintained his connection to the Kyrgyz living there. He was, in short, someone who could ensure that the Qing Altishar was connected to the outer polities, such as Andijan, Kokand, Badakhshan, and Hindustan, even northern India. So he, maintained this power through his kinship network as well. I'm going to skip this part, going to mention that his kinsmen really benefited from their kinship with Akim, because he is the top Kyrgyz chieftain in a Kyrgyz society. But in 1784, Akim overplayed his hand. He falsely accused Kashgar Hakim Bek and Prince Osman of communicating with Samsa Khoja, which was a descendant of the Khojas. And that was basically a charge of treason. Turns out that actually was his younger brother, Amur, who was the guilty party. And he was basically trying to cover it up by, pointing finger at Osman. But Qing officials, even after they found out about this false accusation, they were reluctant to punish Akim. They said Akim was too important. Tashmilik is too important. We can't punish him, so let them just make up. Qianlong was furious about this laxity, so he, in the end, said that Akim and implicated kinsmen should be sent to Beijing, escorted, and Akim was going to be replaced by a few chieftains in order to divide and rule. Afterwards, Amur was executed in Beijing. Akim and his oldest son, Abdullah, were put under house arrest in Beijing for the rest of their lives in recognition of their earlier service. The rest of the clan was divided into inner Kyrgyz chieftains who stayed in Altashar and served the Qing dynasty, and the fugitive warlords who operated in today's Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, trying to get their revenge on their former patron. In contrast, in the second case of Oymar, the Noygut Bio of Aksu, we see a very stable career. He made his way up through military service, eventually receiving rank 3 button that we see here. But what I want to point at here is that 1782, Oymar died. He was succeeded by his son Osman in June, but Osman also died in September, which left the 2-year-old kid named Maima Siddiq as the next successor. And of course, we have to wonder, like, why is a 2-year-old, becoming the next inner Kyrgyz chieftain? Well, it turns out that he had powerful in-laws. So when we look at the family tree of Oymar, which comes from the Qing archives, we learn that Osman was married to Akim's daughter. So basically, this family was connected to the most powerful Kyrgyz elite family in Qing Xinjiang. Not only that, Osman was also married to the sister of Yarkhan Hakim Beg, Boysa Prince Satip Aldi's sister, which meant that Satip Aldi and Aksu Hakim Beg, which actually had jurisdiction over these Kyrgyz, were Maima Siddiq's maternal uncles. So basically what happens here is that the 2-year-old kid is becoming the next leader under the patronage of his powerful inner Kyrgyz and Altishari uncles and grandfathers. Last, we're going to see the case of Berke, who is a Qushchu inner Kyrgyz chieftain who submitted to Qing as a refugee along with his kinsman Narabatu. Again, this guy also rose up within the Qing Xinjiang society, military service in the rebellion, and resolving the mass robbery case of the Kyrgyz against the Kokandi caravans, and then so on. But in 1783, this chieftain decided to desert. He led 500 to 600 households and headed to today's Uzbekistan. And the Qing troops chased after them, and they also sent diplomatic letters to the Bey of Kokand, and the envoys came back in October with a letter from Berke, the former inner Kyrgyz chieftain. And in this letter, he stated his reasons for his departure. First off, he said that he had conflict with his subordinates who broke off from his pasture. And when he tried to, tell the Ushturpan Amban about it, he was driven away without, getting to report on the issue. Not only that, his pasture at Hakshar had been approached by the Aksu authorities recently because there was a silver mine there, and the authorities working with the silver mine, they requisitioned his camels and labor, but didn't really, give him enough compensation for these corvée duties. So in the end, he was angry and he decided to leave his pasture that he received from Qing. But in the end, what is really interesting to us is that his letter really appropriates the universal rhetoric of the Qing dynasty. Because here we see him say, land there is the great emperor's land. Land here is also the great emperor's land. So basically saying that he could serve the Qianlong emperor wherever he was, which was kind of true. But at the same time, he knew, and the Qing state knew, that the Qing's failed attempt to bring him back basically meant that Berke was now a free outer Kyrgyz nomad, roaming in the Talas region in the today's Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan border. So to conclude, I'm going to bring it back to, connect it back to my larger point. Inner Kyrgyz situation and the patron-client relationship between the Qianlong Emperor and the chieftains shows that the boundaries of Qing Xinjiang were elastic. So current scholarship shows that it's either something that stopped at the current guard post, so territorial administrative line, or it was the extent of the back system, the Altishari elites. My research shows that Inner Kyrgyz society further complicated the boundaries. They often lived outside the current guarded post, but they were firmly under the jurisdiction of Qing Altishar Amban. Also, it points to some clues on the future collapse of Qing Xinjiang in 19th century under the jihad of the Khoja's descendants. Current scholarship points to Qing misrule, the back misrule, but also one episode of Qing Saha Kyrgyz conflict in 1825. Jaymin Kim, he also has said that it was exactly the capitalist development of Xinjiang which created some social unrest and the division between the haves and have-nots that contributed to the collapse of Qing Xinjiang. My examination of Qing Inner Kyrgyz relationships shows that there were much longer term changes in the Qing Inner Kyrgyz alliance. In the 1780s, the Qing lost the biggest patron that it had in the figure Kim, and they lost another big client in Berke, and moving on to 1790s, 1800s, and 1810s, especially under the Jia Qing Emperor's reign, we see the Qing being a lot less enthusiastic about cultivating and recruiting these Inner Kyrgyz chieftains, some of whom exactly turned against Qing rule in the 19th century. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. This was a very full and rich presentation. And we are now getting questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to read the first one and then hope that more people will join him. So the first question comes from Neil McKenna. And he asks, in the Qing map of the Xinjiang area, the one from the Library of Congress, were the Chinese names of the places on the map phoneticized from local languages? Did the Kyrgyz tribes share languages?
So I can just speak here, I assume. So yeah, thank you for your question, Neil. Yes, it was phoneticized. So David Berke and others have shown this process. But basically what happened was that, well, in the sources, they just say Muslim script or Muslim language, but we know it to be basically today's Uyghur, or if you may, Turkic, I guess. So yeah, first, Turkic, and then transliterated into Manchu, and in the Library of Congress map, further transliterated into Chinese. So yeah, here we have rounds of transliteration process, which is a very interesting research topic on its own.
Thank you. And before I continue, I just want to apologize for the lack of sound. I was using my earphones and I've now disconnected them. The second question is from Sean Kennedy. Thanks very much for your presentation, Dr. Kim. Did the Qing impose expectations on Chinese language adoption amongst the Turkic people in Xinjiang in the 1700s period of expansion? If so, what did it look like?
Yeah, excellent question. So I'm not, like actually qualified to answer this question because, when I look at these, sources, I focus on, Qing relations with Central Asian polities and, tribes as they term it. So I haven't looked too much into this particular aspect, but given my the knowledge on the scholarship in the 18th century, it seems very unlikely that they would have expected the Turkic population to take up Chinese because the segregation was between the local population and Han Chinese was a very big thing at this time. And actually, one very interesting thing is that the wearing of the queue was considered a privilege that was only allowed to the back clients of the Qing emperor. So the local populace were actually not supposed to have their Qing style hairstyle.
Thank you. The next question is from Richard J. Smith. He says, congratulations, an excellent lecture. You used the term barbarian without qualification, and I wonder if you would like to weigh in the robust debate about this expression.
Yeah, so sorry about the thank you for pointing that out. So I guess I just use the term that is so as you can kind of see, my whole project at this level, and I make it very clear in my research, it's very state-centered because I am interested in interstate relationships between these groups. So yeah, for this particular talk, I don't have much to weigh in on the robust debate, but only to say that you are going to find different versions of civilized, to be civilized or to be incorporated in different borderlands. So for my research in Manchuria, we see the the borderland groups being incorporated into the banner system, and in Xinjiang we see the continuing existence of the various Kirghiz groups, some seen as more into the Qing orbit and others not. In the southwest, we see various groups that the Qing called Miao or Yao, but we know today to be belonging to different Dai, ethno-linguistic groups.
Thank you. The next question, or actually two questions with a follow-up, is from Eric Schlüssel. Since you brought up the collapse of Qing rule in 1864, I'm curious whether you would elaborate on how these patronage relationships informed the lines of conflict that formed in the uprisings. For example, Siddiq Beg in Shanghai, in Kashgar, do you know what his relationship was with these Kyrgyz clients? Also, did you just suggest the Kyrgyz were speaking Uyghur Turkey? That would have been a noticeably different phonology from Kyrgyz. The difference ought to be apparent in the transliterations. This is more a comment than a question, as they say. Thank you for a great talk, Jaymin.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for your informative questions. So I'm sorry that I can't really answer the first question. I stopped at the 1840s. I'm mainly interested in looking at what happened before. I'm mainly interested in looking at interstate relationships in the Qing-centered Asia before the, the treaty system begins to take hold. So I don't really look at the 1860s, but I can tell you that in the first half of the 19th century, you do see the extent of Qing patronage really shrinking. So many Kyrgyz chieftains who allied with the Khojas, whether it's, Sarimsak or Jahangir, they were the ones who were turned away by the Qing officials for whatever reasons. And we do see this larger shift. So in the Qianlong period, we see the distinction between, the Kyrgyz who are farther away and Kyrgyz who are closer to us. Whereas in the 1820s or 30s, I can't put my finger on it right now, the distinction becomes between the Kyrgyz outside the Karen versus the Kyrgyz inside the Karen. So the Qing influence has markedly shrunk already by the 1820s. The second comment, I mean, I didn't mean to say that. I was just talking about the map itself, which was in consultation with the, the Altishari population. Of course, the Kyrgyz did not, speak Turkic, and the phonology is different, which is something that I need to learn more about. Thank you.
So the next question is from Yanshua Zhang. She says, thank you for the wonderful talk. How do you think you would want to position your work within the existing body of scholarship on the new Qing history? Where do you think your major contributions lie?
Yeah, thank you for the excellent question. So, obviously I'm looking at, well, my main contribution, I would say, is that there is new Qing history, and there is a lot of work on Qing history that does acknowledge the importance of new Qing history and inter-Asian factors, but also still just focus on, China proper, the Sinitic culture and society, whatever term you might use. My contribution mainly is to look at Qing imperial formation in global context. So I'm looking at the inter-Asian frontier in Qing-Kokhan relations in Central Asia, but I'm also looking at Qing relations with Joseon, Korea, and Lei and Nguyen, Vietnam, which are sometimes, grouped together under the Sinitic zone or model tributaries. So basically, my contribution, I think, is to put these two groups of scholarship in conversation: new Qing history and more, I don't want to say traditional, but more, new Qing history and, let's just say for the sake of simplicity, non-new Qing history. But I don't want to say it's old Qing history or traditional or anything like that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, and I will just read the ones that I have in front of me, and then I will call it a day. So the next one out of 4 is from Hitomi Tonomura. She says, wonderful research. Seems difficult with so much linguistic variation. Was that not challenging? If you have time, could you say what the first slide under the introduction on the left says? Looks interesting.
First slide on the, let me just share my screen real quick. Sorry. So for Tomi, do you mean this first slide? But yeah, while we are, sharing the screen, the linguistic, yeah, it was challenging. But that is one thing about the research that I found to be very helpful, is that I learned a lot from scholarship on, Lei and Nguyen Vietnam, Joseon Korea, and Kokhan, and so on. Obviously, this work would not have been possible without that. And actually, especially with Korea and Vietnam, if you know classical Chinese, and if you, get educated on the scholarship on these regions and histories, you might find it very surprising how easy it is to read these sources, because the overall grammar and conventions are very similar. You just need to know more specific context. So it was challenging, but also very rewarding.
I see that we only have time to answer one more question, so I sincerely apologize to those of you who have typed questions. You may have a chance to interact with Professor Kim afterwards in a session that is organized by Ina Schlorf. So the last question is from Qing Yuan, saying, what was the Kyrgyz relationship with the Uyghurs? Also, were the Kyrgyz influenced by Islamic sects such as the Naqshbandandi?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, it really depended on, which groups of Kyrgyz you were talking about. So for example, there were, Altishari merchants who were, moving between various Central Asian regions and Altishar, and a lot of times they encounter the Kyrgyz as raiders and robbers. So obviously not a great relationship there. For the Kyrgyz living in Qing Altishar, the inner Kyrgyz that I kept talking about, the relationship was a lot more congenial, or at least like a lot more sustained. And so, for example, I found cases where there is trade dispute. These inner Kyrgyz guys, like they had commissioned some like bolts of cloth from the local weaver in Kashgar, but the guy just like spent all the money and did not deliver on the bolt. So there was dispute, which resulted in murder. So when you think about how that might, such sort of commercial transaction might conspire, of course, these people knew one another. They had been interacting with one another a lot. We also see some evidence of a marital relationship and so on. About the Naqshbandi connection, I can't really say too much on the topic. Like the only religious aspects of the Kyrgyz that I had seen from my own research is the practice of, swearing on the Quran when they're saying, we did not rob these people, basically.
Okay, so that was the last question. So it's time to wrap up. Thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. And thank you to the audience who presented very good questions. We had a very good attendance today at the lecture. So I hope that you have learned a lot from the lecture. This will later be posted on YouTube. So you will be able to recap the lecture at a later date and perhaps follow up some of your questions directly in conversation with Professor Kim. So thank you, and let's give him a warm applause.
Thank you.